To start out with, please like and share this video. I'd really appreciate it. Before I make any more videos analyzing subscribers' pronunciation, I think it might be a good idea to better explain the scale that I use. As I mentioned in a previous video, this scale is adapted from a scale that a colleague of mine created, refined, and tested for his master's thesis. On one end, we have absolute beginners. The other end is reserved for true, authentic native speakers. On average, Spanish majors in their third or fourth year of college who've done a short study abroad program fall between 4 and 5. Now, for people who've been following this whole project closely, I think I've complicated the interpretation of this scale by presenting it in my preferred way. You see, my colleague who researched all this for his master's thesis cut off his scale at level 7. He made it clear that his scale was only for rating second language learners, and that 7 was the maximum rating a second language learner could obtain. His scale didn't even take into consideration natives or native bilinguals. Here's an interesting question. For those of you who felt I was too hard on El Pulpito, would it make you feel better about the score I gave him if I presented the scale this way, with the understanding that 7 is the maximum score? I think that if I'd presented it this way, I wouldn't have gotten any objections. Everyone agrees that El Pulpito's pronunciation is not far away from being as good as it could be. I believe that for future videos, in order to avoid confusion, I'll present the scale this way, including only the part that applies to second language learners, and omitting the part that's normally only achievable by natives, native bilinguals, and rare prodigies. And any of you who are following along with this project, I encourage you to use this version of the scale as well. And I should apologize to El Pulpito for screwing up his evaluation by using the expanded chart. I wouldn't change the rating I gave him, but I think it's clearer what his rating of 6 means when presented this way. With that said, I'd like to talk a bit more about how to use this scale. Surprisingly, being a native speaker of the target language doesn't necessarily make someone a reliable rater. Native speakers tend to be encouraging, sympathetic, and cooperative listeners, which isn't a bad thing, but it doesn't reflect average communication scenarios. And they tend to make subjective judgments about how appealing they find someone's foreign accent, rather than objective statements about whether the person has a foreign accent. As a way of understanding how to apply the scale, I think it's interesting to first look at several ways the scale may be applied naively or incorrectly. Scenario number 1. I'm learning Spanish, and I have a friend from Latin America who tells me my pronunciation is really good. He even says I sound like a Spaniard, so I estimate that my pronunciation is a 6 or 7. I hope it's obvious that this person is just guessing. I think we can all see why there's nothing here that could give anyone the first clue what his actual rating may be. What's more, people are generally not very good at honestly evaluating their own speech, me included, which is why I declined to give myself a rating. Scenario number 2. When native Spanish speakers first meet me, they usually assume that I'm also a native speaker, so I'm pretty sure I'm close to perfect, probably in the 9 to 10 range. When living abroad, I've witnessed dozens of occasions in which a native Spanish speaker has mistaken an American student for a native when that student had a foreign accent that his classmates and people who knew him could hear from a mile away. Interestingly, I personally have had native English speakers tell me I spoke English with a heavy foreign accent and want to know what my native language was. I can only assume that this was because when we first met, they observed me speaking a foreign language and assumed that I wasn't a native English speaker, and this caused them to imagine a foreign accent to my English. The point is that the spontaneous impressions of native speakers are often informed by many things other than a careful evaluation of your actual pronunciation. Scenario number 3. These terms, functionally competent and proficient, aren't very positive. In fact, they sound almost like insults. I speak fluent Spanish, which is better than competent or proficient, so I must be at least an 8. The word fluent means different things to different people. I've seen it used to mean anything from capable of engaging in conversation to indistinguishable from a native. 2 degrees of proficiency that are far, far apart. What's more, you can have a large vocabulary, good grammar, and outstanding listening comprehension, and be capable of conversation on most any topic, and still have a lot of room for improvement in pronunciation. So you may be a fluent speaker of the language, whatever you interpret fluent to mean, and still have pronunciation that's merely partly functional. I've met many people who fit this description. Scenario number 4. I'm a native speaker evaluating someone, and I understood every single word she said. You can't get better than that. She's a 10. Being understandable is not a high bar. Most of what you say is understandable at level 3. What's more, whether a native listener understands depends as much on the native listener as it does on the student who's speaking. Let's say that 2 native Spanish speakers are evaluating the same student. One of them is a teacher who teaches Spanish to native English-speaking students, so she hears Spanish spoken with a heavy English accent all day, every day. The other speaks only Spanish and has never met a native English speaker. Would it surprise you to find that the first person understood heavily accented Spanish better than the second person? Scenario number 5. I'm an evaluator evaluating someone else. He's a native French speaker, and I just love French accents. I could listen to them all day. He gets a 7. When we were training raters, this was one of the most difficult things to get them to understand. This scale is not a way for you to rate how pleasant you find someone's foreign accent. It's supposed to be an objective measure of how much of a foreign accent they have, which doesn't necessarily correlate with whether you like it or not. Person A may have a strong foreign accent that you enjoy listening to, while person B may have a relatively mild foreign accent that you hate. Some comments we heard a lot from native raters were things like, "Yeah, I heard that he pronounced that with an accent, but I liked how it sounded." Or, "When people pronounce it like that, it doesn't really bother us." Again, the point isn't whether someone's foreign accent bothers you, but whether he or she has a foreign accent. Scenario number 6. I'm a native speaker evaluating someone, and there are native speakers of my own language whose speech just grates on me. This student's foreign accent sounds pleasant to me by comparison. He gets a 9. Once again, this has nothing to do with it. Let me give an example that some of you will be familiar with. Ex-US President George W. Bush speaks English with a strong regional accent and various personal idiosyncrasies. Many English speakers find his speech unpleasant to listen to. The actress Gal Gadot speaks English with an obvious foreign accent, but people generally find her to be charming and intelligent sounding. It might be tempting to say, Gal Gadot's English pronunciation scores higher than George W. Bush's. No, it doesn't. George W. Bush would never be mistaken for a non-native English speaker. Even if you don't like his accent, if you're being honest, you must admit that he speaks English like a native English speaker. While Gal Gadot, no matter how witty her personality and charming her speech, would never be mistaken as a native English speaker. Again, the scale isn't a means for you to rate how pleasant or unpleasant you find someone's speech, but how objectively native-like it sounds. All of these scenarios have something in common. The evaluations are based on intangible impressions, subjective opinions, and even blind guesses. What none of them has is any kind of objectivity. So how do you produce a more objective rating? In order to provide a more objective rating, a rater listens to an adequately long and revealing sample of someone's speech and makes a note of those instances in which the person's pronunciation deviates from authentic. And then the rater looks for patterns in those deviations and identifies the verbal description from this part of the scale that most accurately describes the speaker's pronunciation. With practice, raters get so that they know intuitively what range a person falls into, but even the intuitions of a skilled and practiced rater may be off by a whole point one way or the other. Nobody can give a reliable rating based on their intuitions alone. Every rater needs to compare demonstrable patterns of pronunciation to these standard descriptions in order to produce a reliable rating. These parts of the scale are not used for deriving someone's rating. They potentially provide information about the rating once it's been decided, but they're not consulted for determining what the rating must be. So, for example, someone who's been given a rating of 5 can look at the scale and say, my pronunciation is functionally competent, which means my pronunciation is usually fairly easy to understand, but I still have a foreign accent. But what you wouldn't do as a rater is look at something from this row or this row to decide what rating to assign. That's not how it works. Things in these rows are just too subjective. Scores are only derived from this part of the scale. Alright, so that's a more in-depth discussion of how to use this scale, which you'll be seeing more of in future videos. I've really been enjoying this project and I hope you'll join us. Several other subscribers have submitted samples for evaluation and I'll be posting a video with the next one soon. Please like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.